Welcome to the third part of our lecture series on the road to the American Revolution. So far, we've explored how the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, and the early colonial struggles for religious and political independence laid the intellectual and social groundwork for the Revolution. In this section, we turn our attention to the French and Indian Wars, an often overlooked chapter in this story that had profound and lasting consequences for the American colonies. The French and Indian Wars, which raged from 1754 to 1763, were not simply frontier skirmishes or conflicts over trade routes. They were a decisive contest for imperial dominance in North America, pitting Britain and its American colonies against France and its indigenous allies. As we will see, the war's outcome redrew the map of North America, strained colonial economies, and intensified tensions between Britain and its colonial subjects. Moreover, they shaped colonial attitudes about identity, military service, and the burdens of empire. By examining these conflicts, we will uncover how the seeds of revolution were sown, not only in the minds and hearts of colonists, but also on the battlefields and treaty tables of the French and Indian Wars. The expansion of empires in North America reflected the policies of European states locked in a relentless competition for power and wealth. From the time of the Glorious Revolution, English foreign policy aimed at limiting the expansion of French influence. This in turn resulted in a series of 4 wars. As the 18th century wore on, these conflicts between the two countries increasingly involved their American colonies, as well as Spain and its colonies. The outcome of each of the wars in America depended no less on the participation of colonists and natives than on the policies and strategies of European powers. The conclusion of the final conflict signaled a dramatic shift in North American history. King William's War was a North American extension of the War of the Grand Alliance, waged by William III of Great Britain, who took the throne after the Glorious Revolution, and his allies, the League of Augsburg, against France under Louis XIV. Canadian and New England colonists divided in support of their mother countries and together, with their respective Indian allies, assumed primary responsibility for their own defense. The British, led by Sir William Phips, captured Port Royal, Acadia, later called Nova Scotia, but failed to take Quebec. The French and Indians under the Count de Frontenac carried out successful attacks on Schenectady, New York, Salmon Falls in present-day New Hampshire, and Casco Bay in present-day Maine, but failed against their main target, Boston. The protracted war ended with the Treaty of Ryswick. Because of the importance of Indian participation, it is also known as the first of the 4 French and Indian Wars. Queen Anne's War was the second in a series of wars fought between Great Britain and France in North America for control of the continent. It was contemporaneous with the War of Spanish Succession in Europe. British military aid to the colonists was devoted mainly to defense of the area around Charleston, South Carolina, and the exposed New York to New England frontier with Canada. English settlements were subject to brutal raids by French forces and their Indian allies. After the British capture of the key French fortress of Port Royal in 1710, French-ruled Acadia became the British province of Nova Scotia. In addition, under the terms of the Treaties of Utrecht, Britain acquired Newfoundland and the Hudson Bay region from France. The Iroquois League was a confederacy of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk in New York State. In America, the first 2 imperial wars transformed the role of this league. During King William's War, the Iroquois allied with the English, but received little help from them when the French and their Indian allies attacked Iroquois villages. By 1700, the Iroquois League had suffered such horrendous losses, perhaps a quarter of the population had died from causes related to the war, that leaders sought an alternative to direct alliance with the English. With the Grand Settlement of 1701, the Iroquois adopted a policy of neutrality with regard to French and British empires. Their strategic location between New France and the British colonies allowed them to serve as a geographic and diplomatic buffer. They could play English against French, gaining favors from one side in return for promises not to ally with the other. This neutralist policy ensured that for nearly 50 years, neither Britain nor France could gain ascendancy in North America. Iroquois neutrality offered benefits to the Europeans as well as the Indians. The British began to negotiate with them for land. The Iroquois claimed sovereignty over much of the country west of the Middle and Chesapeake colonies. To smooth relations with the British, the Iroquois sold them land formerly occupied by Delawares and Susquehannock tribes. Meanwhile, a neutral Iroquois League, claiming control over the Ohio Valley and blocking British access across the Appalachian Mountains, helped the French protect the strategic corridor that linked Canada and Louisiana. If the British ever established a permanent presence in the Ohio Valley, however, the Iroquois would cease to be of use to the French. The Iroquois remained reasonably effective at keeping the British out of the valley until the late 1740s. The next European war, however, altered these circumstances. The third confrontation between Britain and France in Europe, the War of Austrian Succession, King George's War to the British colonists, began as a small war between Britain and Spain in 1739. But in 1744, France joined in the war against Britain, and the conflict once again erupted in North America. France and Britain continued to experience disputes over the boundaries of Acadia, Nova Scotia, and northern New England, as well as over control of the Ohio River Valley. The battle brought bloody border raids on both sides with the aid of native allies, but the war brought little effective military aid from either mother country. New Englanders saw yet another chance to attack Canada. This time their target was the great fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, a naval base that dominated the Gulf of St. Lawrence. An expedition from Massachusetts and Connecticut, supported by a squadron of Royal Navy warships, captured Louisbourg in 1745. This success cut Canada off from French reinforcement. English forces should now have been able to conquer New France. The war ended with the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle because colonists were sick of the costly and vain struggle. The treaty restored conquered territory to both sides, but never answered important colonial questions of who controlled the Ohio River Valley and what the boundaries of New England truly were. The French and Indian War was an extension of the 7 Years' War, which was the largest military conflict before the French Revolution that involved all European powers. These included France, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, Russia versus Prussia, Hanover, and Great Britain. It was fought in Europe over the Habsburg family's attempt to take back the province of Silesia, which they had lost previously in the Prussian War of Austrian Succession. The war extended into the colonies, once again asking the same question: who controlled the upper Ohio River Valley? The British hoped to open the valley for trade and settlement by people from Virginia and Pennsylvania. But the bigger issue behind the French and Indian War was which national culture was to dominate the heart of North America. Initially, the Canadian soldiers fighting for the French are successful because of their use of guerrilla-style warfare learned from their native allies. They raided frontier English settlements, killing and capturing hundreds of civilians and forcing tens of thousands to flee. In addition, soldiers attacked British fortified outposts whenever possible. In response, the British dispatched troops to Fort Duquesne, a fort previously held by the British under Major General Edward Braddock. Braddock got within 10 miles and his entire force of 1,450 men was destroyed by natives and Canadian militiamen. This set the tone for the next 3 years and opened a period of demoralization and internal conflict in the British colonies. The Europeanization of the war began to help the British as the British began to dominate the 7 Years' War back home. William Pitt, Secretary of State, directed the war effort from 1757 to 1761. He astutely realized that the colonists distrusted British command due to their having to bear the financial burden of the war with no real say in the fighting. Pitt promised reimbursement to the colonies in proportion to their contribution and restored colonial morale and willingness to fight. The British and the French had very different styles of fighting, with the British practicing professional military standards. This required marching in formation without breaking rank, and iron discipline enforced through savage punishment, such as hundreds of lashes for small infractions. Very few colonial volunteers were able to meet the standards, and the British troops disliked those who tried. The colonists saw the British officers as brutal taskmasters, and the British saw the colonists as lazy cowards. In contrast, the French fought using a guerrilla warfare style learned from their native allies. All this changed when Marquis de Montcalm took over the leadership of French troops. He was a gentleman who believed in the proper rules of warfare and preferred professional standards of military conduct. His choice to change the style of fighting isolated native allies whom he had already deemed as savage. General Montcalm led the siege against the British-held Fort William Henry. The fort was located at the southern end of Lake George on the frontier between the British province of New York and the French province of Canada. It was garrisoned by a poorly supported force of British regulars and provincial militia. After several days of bombardment, the British surrendered to the French, whose force included nearly 2,000 native warriors. In one of the most notorious incidents of the French and Indian War, Montcalm's native allies violated the agreed-upon terms of surrender and attacked the British column, which had been deprived of ammunition as it left the fort. They killed and scalped a significant number of soldiers, took as captives women, children, servants, and enslaved workers, and slaughtered sick and wounded prisoners. Early accounts of the events called it a massacre and implied that as many as 1,500 people were killed, though it is unlikely more than 200 people, less than 10% of the British fighting strength, were actually killed in the massacre. The exact role of Montcalm and other French leaders in the massacre of Fort William Henry is unknown. Some historians contend that he anticipated what was going to happen and deliberately ignored it. Montcalm and other French leaders had repeatedly promised the natives opportunities for the glory and trophies of war, including plunder, scalping, and taking of captives. In the aftermath of the battle, captives taken were ransomed, meaning the natives had no visible trophies. The terms of surrender at Fort William Henry effectively denied the many significant opportunities for plunder. The war provisions were claimed by the French army, and personal effects of the British were to stay with them, leaving nothing to their tribal allies. This bred resentment, as it appeared that the French were conspiring with their enemies, the British, against their friends, the natives, leaving them without any promised war trophies. Many natives ended their alliance with France at this point, effectively reducing the French ranks and their ability to fight the British. The end of the French and Indian War came when Pitt sent thousands of British troops to fight beside tens of thousands of colonial troops. They successfully seized Louisbourg again in 1758, as Canada experienced crippling shortages of supplies, weapons, and trade goods. In addition, the British emissaries convinced the Delawares and the Shawnees to abandon their French alliance. In 1758, the British remarched on Fort Duquesne under the leadership of Colonel George Washington, and French defenders blew up the fort rather than surrendering and retreated to the Great Lakes. From this point on, there were no British defeats or setbacks, and the French won no victories and lost a costly battle in Quebec in 1759. In addition, the French lost the war back home, hurting their navy's ability to operate on the Atlantic, which prevented reinforcements and supplies from arriving in the colonies. The French and Indian War concluded with an uninterrupted series of British victories. This resulted in all sugar islands coming under British control in the Caribbean. In 1763, the British and French established peace with the Treaty of Paris, which gave France back the West Indies Islands, but also gave the rest of their North American territory to England. The treaty gave to Spain all of the land in the Trans-Mississippi West in order to pay for their assistance of the British. It gave to Britain all the lands east of the Mississippi River except New Orleans. Finally, Britain returned the Philippines and Cuba to Spain and received Florida in compensation. Following the war, Britain began to keep a substantial body of troops stationed in America, even during peacetime. The British government also issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbid white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The purpose of the proclamation line was to keep settlers apart from natives and to prevent fighting between them. Also, it meant to keep the colonists closer to the coast for easier control by the Crown. Both of these acts greatly upset the colonists, as did the passage of the Quartering Acts, which required colonial assemblies to provide barracks and supplies for the troops. Colonists strongly distrusted standing armies, as they feared for the potential of using the troops for coercion rather than protection. In concluding this third part of our 5-part series on the road to the American Revolution, we have explored the French and Indian Wars as a pivotal turning point in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. Far from being a distant European conflict, these wars drew the colonists deeper into the imperial struggles of the 18th century, linking their fates with the fortunes of the British Empire. Yet even as the colonists celebrated victory and new territorial security, the war's aftermath, marked by British debt, new taxes, and the tightening of imperial controls, planted the seeds of colonial discontent. As we move forward in this series, we will see how the lessons and legacies of the French and Indian Wars shaped colonial expectations of British rule and laid the groundwork for the revolutionary debates and protests that followed.